excited. All three of the presenters encouraged to speak, including Elizabeth Sanders. Are quite different, but quite intriguing in the presentation. But before I go any further, I want to introduce a dear guest this evening, and that is our Tibet refugee scholar for the Pell Center, that's Salve. I say that because Chotso is a nurse. She's actually, for the first time, as a Pell refugee scholar, studied at the undergraduate level with our nursing department. And from what I understand, Chotso is learning quite a bit, so it's a pleasure. I happen to know the hospital she works at in Dharamsala. It's Salve. It's a high tuberculosis rate because, like I say, Dharamsala is not the most hospitable environment. But it's an honor and a privilege to have you here. And let me explain a little background. In 1989, as chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Pell sponsored legislation that would bring 15 Tibetans from outside Tibet to study in the United States. It's a point of enrichment in the program. It was really not funded with any increase for over 2 decades. And it's because of your support to the citizens of the Pell Center that we're able to bring Chotso here and make a difference in the world. It may seem like a small step, but I don't think it is. I have worked in Dharamsala. Summer 2008, my daughter and I went to Dharamsala. My daughter had 28 Tibetan refugee children, most of them orphans under her care. I don't think she'll ever be the same. But the cause of Tibet is very personal. It's very personal for Senator Pell. He was an extraordinary advocate for human rights when no one had that kind of voice. I've tried to stress that in every seminar I've taught. Our mission here at the Pell Center is very, very simple. It's to honor and promote the legacy of Pell. But its execution can be quite often complex, and it's a real honor and a privilege tonight to introduce one of my dearest friends, and a colleague I respect to no end. I had many, many conversations with her about bringing this holiness to the Pell Center, but she is the one most responsible for coordinating the 2005 holiness visit, which happened to be the 55th year of its enthronement as spiritual political leader of that. Mary Beth worked for 8 years on relations staff with Senator Pell at the International Campaign for Tibet, with whom we have a strong collaborative partnership. She has served as Executive Director of Government Relations, is currently Vice President for Advocacy. When she was on Senator Pell's staff, she was both Deputy and Acting Spokesperson for monitoring and reporting on human rights and refugee issues. I think you can understand her passion. There was a lot of, I think, unnecessary debate this last week about the award of the Nobel Peace Prize. It is a significant event. 20 years ago, His Holiness won the Nobel Peace Prize. I myself have been shared in the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. It's a recognition. It doesn't necessarily change anything in the world. But the point is, this is a cause and these are people that we should not forget. They have suffered terribly in the world. And we need to recognize their voices. Very much.
Coincidentally, I got to work for one of the great men of this state, one of the great American statesmen, Senator Pell. Pell. And that, through some wonderful cosmic karma, has brought me to the Pell Center on several occasions, and I'm very happy to be here with you today. I walked a little bit around in the audience before we got started to get to know some of you a bit. Tibet is a very complex issue, and I want to make sure that we have time to explore all the different areas of your particular interest, whether it be refugees or the current political standoff with China, the fact that President Barack Obama, who many of us supported, and many of us support the Dalai Lama, broke with precedents, and for the first time since 1991, the White House did not meet with the Dalai Lama on a visit to Washington. I know that if Senator Pell had been alive, he would not have been very happy about that. We did bring His Holiness to Capitol Hill. He met with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Chairman Kerry gave him a nice tea, and almost all the members turned out. It was a very good showing. And Speaker Pelosi spent almost 6 hours during his visit. So he had a good, very good visit on the Hill, and for that, I'm sure Senator would be happy. I'm going to start off talking about the geography of Tibet. I'm also going to go and talk about the history of Tibet, and then I want to bring us into the current situation inside Tibet. So that's where my talk is going. So keep in mind as I go along any other issues that as I said, I want to discuss. Some of you I've met and know a great deal about Tibet. Have you been to Tibet? And I know that there's some very accomplished academics in the audience as well. So if I get my dates wrong, please just speak up. I'm an advocate, so you know how we are. We tend to like to big punch and worry too much on the details. Okay, let me again start talking about the geography of Tibet. And I have slides. That's the Tibetan Plateau. And traditionally, Tibet is defined by its geography. There is considerable confusion as to what constitutes Tibet. In fact, this dispute is at the core of the discussions between the Chinese and the Tibetan government that have been going on since 2002. So there you see Tibet in the context of the People's Republic of China. You can see the enormity of the Tibetan Plateau. So I think a lot of us tend to think of Tibet as a small Himalayan kingdom. It's not. It's about a third of the landmass of China. Tibet is comprised of 3 main areas: Amdo, which is northeastern Tibet; Kham, which is eastern Tibet; and Utsam, which is central and western Tibet. The Tibet Autonomous Region, shown on this map, was set up by the Chinese government in 1965 and covers the area of Tibet west of the Yangtze River. The rest of Tibet, Amdo and Kham, have been incorporated into Chinese provinces, and where Tibetans were said to have compact inhabitancy in these provinces, they were designated by the Chinese as autonomous prefectures and counties. As a result, most of Qinghai, parts of Gansu, Sichuan, and Yunnan provinces are acknowledged by the Chinese authorities as Tibetan. The term Tibetan in my presentation today deals with all of the Tibetan areas encompassed into the People's Republic of China. Following the communist victory in 1949, Mao Zedong announced his intention to take Tibet. In 1950, the People's Liberation Army had crossed westward across the plateau to central Tibet. Attempts by the Tibetan government to secure international support for repelling the Chinese invasion failed, largely due to deference to the nationalist Chinese, who were still receiving political and economic support from the West. With no other course of action possible, and the PLA on the outskirts of Lhasa, the Tibetan government agreed under duress to give up their sovereignties for peace, for local autonomy, and for the preservation of the institution of the Dalai Lama. With this agreement in place and the PLA well established in eastern Tibet, the communists accelerated their implementation of so-called democratic reforms, such as land collectivization and the seizing of monasteries and expelling monks. This destabilized and terrorized much of the population in eastern Tibet. Thousands of Tibetans fled to Lhasa, seeking refuge in their religious capital and in their protector leader, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the protector patron of Tibet, known by the Tibetans as Chenrezig. The Dalai Lama and his government, in an uneasy alliance with communists, found it more and more difficult to prevail in the interest of the Tibetan people. In the spring of 1959, the Dalai Lama was invited to a cultural performance at the PLA encampment on the outskirts of Lhasa. He was instructed by the garrison to come without his traditional retinue of bodyguards and attendants. The Tibetans feared for his life. Monks in eastern Tibet had already been taken, kidnapped, and executed. They surrounded his residence in a circle of prayer and protection. On March 10th, in the dark of the night, the young Dalai Lama, dressed as a simple Gari, slipped out of his palace and began a 3-week journey to India, the PLA in pursuit. These are photographs of the surrender of the employees of the workers in the Potala Palace. These are monks giving up their weapons. This is Holiness escaping. And he's arrived in India. Immediately after his arrival in India, the international community, through the offices of the International Commission of Jurists, began an examination of Chinese policy in Tibet. The commission found that almost all of the rights which together allowed the full and legitimate expression of human personality appeared to be denied to the Tibetan people. On the basis of the available evidence, the report concluded, it would seem difficult to recall a case in which ruthless suppression of man's essential dignity had been more systematically and efficiently carried out. Again, 5 years later, the commission found that the situation continued unabated, including a continuance of ill treatment of many monks, lamas, and other religious figures, resulting in death through excessive torture, beatings, starvation, and forced labor. In 1965, the Chinese created the Tibet Autonomous Region, and the United Nations General Assembly, where the nationalist Chinese still sat, passed the last of 3 resolutions calling on China to cease practices which deprive the Tibetan people of their fundamental human rights and freedoms, including their right to self-determination. In 1966, the Cultural Revolution began, and every aspect of Tibetan culture came under attack. 10 years later, by 1976, Tibet's cultural and religious heritage, including almost all of its 6,000 monasteries, lay in ruins. Tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Tibetans were killed. And a post-Mao liberalization in the 1980s allowed a brief revival of Tibetan religion and culture, but that was replaced shortly with very hardline policies in Tibet. Coinciding with this period, in 1989, His Holiness visited the United States Congress, and he made his first But by 1994, the Chinese government convened a work forum on Tibet. It was called the National Forum on Work in Tibet, and it was a key conclave of senior officials in the Chinese government. And in that conclave, they identified the influence of the Dalai Lama as the root of Tibet's instability, and they mapped out a new repressive strategy for Tibet. The forum endorsed rapid economic development, including the transfer of more Chinese in Tibet, and a campaign to curtail the influence of the Dalai Lama and crack down on dissent. The results of the forum included heightened control of religious activity and a denunciation campaign against His Holiness, an increase in political arrests, stepped up surveillance of potential dissidents, and increased repression of even non-political protests. Since the late 1990s, there has been further escalation of repression in Tibet, marked by an intensive political free education drive in the monasteries, at which monks were told that they were required to sign loyalty pledges to the Communist Party or face expulsion. A clampdown on information coming from Tibet, which was punishable with imprisonment. The sentencing of major religious leaders, and a ban on photographs of the Dalai Lama in public places. The boy designated by the Dalai Lama as the reincarnation of the Panchen Lama, a significant figure in Tibet's Buddhist hierarchy, was taken into detention when he was 6 years old in 1994, and he remains disappeared to this day. Chinese leaders have begun a campaign against traditional Tibetan culture identified as both an obstacle to development and linked to Tibetan nationalism. In 1997, the Chinese government went so far as to label Buddhism as a foreign culture. Chinese government centrally planned policies have failed Tibetans, and political campaigns have created a climate of fear and resentment throughout the Tibet Plateau. Tibetan oppression in the following areas: right of autonomy, threats to Tibetan identity, population transfer, cultural heritage, language, development, rule of law, environment, the right to education, to housing, to health, the use of torture, freedom, the constraint on freedoms of expression, on freedom of religion, assembly. All of these have kindled tensions that exploded in March 2008 and have spread across the Tibetan Plateau. These are Chinese troops coming into Tibet. This is the railway that was completed that crosses the Tibetan Plateau from the mainland all the way to Lhasa. The Chinese are planning a second railway. On March 10, 2008, several hundred Tibetan monks from Drapo monasteries, one of the great three Gelugpa monasteries of Tibet, began an orderly march into Lhasa. The monks protesting against political campaigns at their monastery that were impeding religious practice were stopped by armed police. Some wept as they recited long life prayers for His Holiness the Dalai Lama. On the same day, chosen because it was the symbolic 49th anniversary of the Tibetan uprising, monks in smaller, more remote monasteries in eastern Tibet also protested against China's policies of repression. It was the beginning of a wave of protests that swept across the Tibetan Plateau, to be met with often brutal crackdowns by the Chinese authorities, unprecedented, in fact, in its efficiency and its intensity. Over the past 50 years, China has instituted hardline policies that undermine Tibetan culture and religion. The Tibetan people have been denied fundamental rights. The use of their language has been downgraded, and their economic resources have been appropriated by the Chinese state. with increasing numbers of Chinese migrants moving to the Tibetan plateau, Tibetans had reached a boiling point. In risking their lives to make their feelings clear, they propelled Tibet to a major concern for China in its domestic and international engagement. But Tibetans successfully conveyed to the world the message that the Dalai Lama represents their interests and not the Chinese state. Since the Great Pongpongs took to the streets on March 2008, the Chinese government has engaged in a comprehensive cover-up of the torture, disappearance, and killings that have taken place in Tibet, combined with a virulent propaganda offensive against the Dalai Lama. New campaigns directed against Tibetan culture and religion mean that almost any expression of Tibetan identity not directly sanctioned by the state can be branded as reactionary or splittist and penalized with long prison sentences or worse. Singers, artists, and writers have disappeared and face torture under a new drive against cultural products with suspect ideological content, such as songs referring to the Dalai Lama. In music bars, Tibetan performers are no longer allowed to address the audience as Tibetan brothers and sisters because it is considered subversive to the unity of the nationalities. And yet, this is a rare period when protests have continued in Tibet despite the severity of Beijing's response. It is also a time when there has been an unprecedented outpouring of emotion and expression of views in blogs, articles, and literary magazines published by scholar monks or lay poets, or songs and ballads sung in bars or uploaded on YouTube. This new cultural resurgence is being led in Tibet by a new generation of Tibetans, many of whom have been educated in Chinese as well as the Tibetan language. Unlike the older generation of Tibetans, young intellectuals did not experience the takeover of Tibet by China or the excesses of the Cultural Revolution, but they are aware of both the political struggle being waged against the Chinese state and the renaissance of their own Tibetan cultural identity. In one book that was banned as soon as it was published in Tibet, a Tibetan writer reflects, in a year that turned out to be like a raging storm, how could we remain silent in fear? My work is a sketch of history written in the blood of a new generation. A Tibetan blogger wrote, Tibetans are no longer just trying to fit into the Chinese national story. Instead, we are creating our own. It is a new cultural moment. Young Tibetans are starting to have the chance to be many things and at the same time still be Tibetan. These creative and courageous writers dare to refute China's official narrative, representing a more profound challenge to the Beijing authorities than perhaps ever before. They find the cause of the protests that convulse the plateau not in some phantom charges against the Dalai clique in exile, but in the tragic Tibetan history that began in the 1950s and the shortcoming of China's Tibet policy. The most well-known Tibetan writer, Wosar, an accomplished poet and one of the most eloquent and fierce analysts of Chinese oppression in Tibet, argues that the events of 2008 and up until now are as significant in contemporary Tibetan history as those of March 1959, when tensions against the Chinese presence in Tibet escalated into an uprising and led to the Dalai Lama fleeing Tibet. Wosar writes, having been through the events of 2008 that shook the world, Tibet is no longer the Tibet of the past, and the Tibetan people are no longer the Tibetan people people of the past. Everything has undergone a genuine transformation. If one pretends to be aloof and indifferent and thinks that blood can just be washed away and that the truth can be covered over, or that atrocities will not be condemned and suffering will not be pondered, if one acts as though nothing has happened and thinks that life goes on as before and the sun will rise as ever, this is just self-deception. Tibetans are breaking through the silence, and there are more and more instances of our voices being bravely raised, encouraging ever more Tibetans. At the height of the crackdown and protest in 2008, a group of Chinese intellectuals bravely wrote and published on the internet a petition calling for an end to the deception and propaganda to China's media coverage, and to warn of the harm that the authorities' response to the protest was doing to relations between the Tibetan and Chinese peoples. The stakes for the organizers and signatories of the petition were enormous. The protests in Tibet dramatically and unequivocally demonstrated that China's policies in Tibet had evidently failed. At a time when the Chinese government was preparing to host the Olympic Games in Beijing and was very keen to present its best face to the world, the signatories inevitably standing in opposition to powerful, ruthless, and hardline factions within the Chinese system were at great risk. It is not an exaggeration to say that they were risking their own personal freedom by signing the petition. Their petition, 12 suggestions for dealing with the Tibetan situation, not only states that there have been serious mistakes in China's policies in Tibet, it also urges conscientious reflection on the past, on the part of the authorities, and calls on the Chinese people to be calm and tolerant and to reflect deeply on what is happening. Finally, however, the signatories couch their comments in terms that display their own love and their own concern for China and their worries for the future concord between the Chinese and Tibetan peoples. While all the points of the 12 suggestions for dealing with the Tibetan situation are timely, important, and well considered, I'd like to read to you suggestion number 12, because I think that it can contribute significantly to reducing the tensions, as well as provide a lasting solution to the Tibetan problem. Number 12 says, we hold that we must eliminate animosity and bring about national reconciliation and continue to increase divisions between nationalities. A country that wishes to avoid the partition of its territory must first avoid divisions among its nationalities. Therefore, we appeal to the leaders of our country to hold direct dialogue with the Dalai Lama. We hope that the Chinese and Tibetan people will do away with the misunderstandings between them, develop their interaction with each other, and achieve unity. Government departments, as much as popular organizations and religious figures, should make great efforts toward this goal. The initiative of this group of courageous Chinese individuals has had a strong impact on the psyche of the Tibetan people inside Tibet and in exile. And it also supports the Dalai Lama's position of relying confidently on the people for a lasting solution. My organization, the International Campaign for Tibet, believes the public release of this petition was a significant step towards reestablishing a peaceful relationship between the Tibetan and Chinese. ICT recognized this undertaking as a monumental step toward unity and national and mutual cooperation between the Chinese and Tibetan. And during His Holiness's recent visit to Washington. We presented the individuals who signed this petition, represented by Wang Lishang, one of the authors of the petition, with His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Speaker Pelosi present, with our annual Vibrant Truth Award. This is a legacy moment for Tibet. It's a legacy moment that I'm pleased to share with you, Mrs. Pell, with Peter of the Pell Center, and with Salve, Regina. Let's just see what else we have here that I didn't get to. These are all photos of what is happening in Tibet. This is the far eastern side of Tibet, where, look at these PLL troops assaulting this monastery. This is in Machu in eastern Tibet. Overwhelming force. This is the negotiations between the United Front Work Department, which is an organ of the Communist Party, and the representatives of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, which are on your right. That's His Holiness the Dalai Lama receiving the Congressional Gold Medal from President George Bush and Speaker Pelosi in the Capitol Rotunda in 2007. There he is at the ceremony, quite pleased. You can see my chairman of the board there. Mr. Richard here. Always asking. And there he is. So I'm very happy to take your questions now. I apologize for the kind of stumbling through that with my sore throat, and I can't see very well up here, so I'm trying to read my remarks the best I could, so I apologize for that.
No, I'll help you out.
That was an overview.
Surely you have some questions or comments. I'm wondering if you might just give a little background on how the ICT was founded.
Yeah, absolutely. When His Holiness came to Washington, D.C. in the late 1980s, the enthusiasm in the Congress was extraordinary. He had not yet met with an American president, George Herbert Walker Bush, who came first in 1991. But in order to capture the enthusiasm and to press the cause of Tibet in Congress, primarily the International Campaign for Tibet was founded. Now we have an office in London, an office in Brussels, an office in Amsterdam, an office in Berlin, field offices in Asia, India, Nepal, and people in and out of Tibet. And we are primarily an advocacy organization. We do some campaigning with public or membership organizations. We are supported almost entirely by individual gifts. Not a big surprise that a lot of corporations that do business in China are not supportive of ours. What else can I say about ICT?
That's a great background. Well, I'll say this, ICT means constant support. It is an advocacy group. It's a non-governmental organization, and it depends on support. There is a wide network.
We have about 300,000 members. 300,000 members.
And Edward, I was just thinking, looking at this picture, you're probably pretty jealous it's your sister up there in that picture, not you, aren't you?
Where? Who?
This is Edward Mutongo.
Oh my God, that's your sister?
That's Mutongo. There have been now before from the family from Rwanda and this university. It's a real tradition.
Does she have that picture autographed? If she wants it autographed, make sure you get it to Peter. We'll have that done for her.
She's a law student at Suffolk University. She wants to be working with the United Nations. Very encouraging. I'm sure there's questions or comments.
Thank you for your explanation. If things went reasonably well, next 5, 10, 20 years, what would be a scenario of realistic progress that might be made? Would it be some specific milestones or events that would take place toward what you'd like to see achieved? And if so, would outsiders have some specific roles in that?
There is a dialogue that I referred to at the beginning underway between the Chinese and the Chinese government representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. There is a plan for autonomy that the Tibetans have presented to the Chinese government. And in that plan, there are building blocks for the realization of autonomy. The Chinese Constitution makes significant guarantees of autonomy, but unfortunately, in one part of the Constitution they do this, and the other part of the Constitution they take away the efficacy of the implementation. So I think with the progress on the building blocks of autonomy, which include education and language, self-determination over the development plans, resource extraction, those kinds of things. I think the most pressing issue right now really is to deal with the pressures of the Chinese influx into Tibet, because it has consequences on even the very fundamental economy. Because if you are just a poorly educated Chinese migrant from Sichuan, you still have more advantages in Tibet than Tibet, because you speak Chinese. So there needs to be some kind of limits, and there are limits elsewhere on Chinese movement. In Hong Kong, for example, the local Hong Kong authorities can set limits on migration into Hong Kong. So if there are precedents, I would say that's a few things there. In the real immediate future, right now, the Chinese have to agree that the dialogue is about the underlying problems, the legitimate grievances of the Tibetan people, and not the disposition of the Dalai Lama. Right now, the Chinese just want to talk about if he comes back, what he will do, so on and so forth. And the Tibetans want to talk about the 6 million Tibetans.
Mary Beth, could you say how many Han Chinese there are now in Tibet as opposed to native Tibetans? Can you break that
No,
down?
I can't, because floating population isn't counted, and the PLA is not counted. There are huge pockets of population that are not counted. The railway, which is up and running, brings enormous amount of Chinese migrants to Tibet every month. It's a big problem throughout China, this big floating population. But it's certainly a problem. If you think about Tibet as you think about the American West as being a place for people who were unable to make their fortune elsewhere and wanted to take the risk no matter what, to live in an inhospitable climate, high altitude, foreign culture, all of that. This is kind of, it's not completely analogous, but I think that paints a good picture.
We have some in the back, Father Barrera. And Father, if I can introduce you, Father Barrera is our Pell scholar for this academic year.
So is Tibet subject to the one-child policy? And how is the birth rate in Tibet, the local Tibetans, relative to the Han influx?
The minority populations don't have the same restriction, but Tibet has terrible child mortality and chronic illnesses because of malnutrition. They have a chronic bone deformity, and they have they lose many children. They also are a nomadic culture primarily, and as a nomadic culture, the children work with the herds and so on and so forth. So they typically have more children, not many. You know, you have 8 children and 4 children to survive. It's that kind of a situation in Tibet. But yes, they have much bigger families than the one-child policy. Even the one-child policy you have the money, you can opt out of the one-child policy to some extent as well. You just deal and pay the fines. So it's more punitive in some areas than others. Also, if you're a cadre, if you're a member of the Communist Party, then you have to abide by the one-child policy, even if you're Tibetan.
Bob, we have one right behind you, and then we'll get it to you.
Bob Jackson, thank you very much for coming and giving a very wonderful lecture. What resources does Tibet have that they might interest the world and the other Chinese in?
Could I jump in on this?
Yeah, I mean, he's the resource expert, but just let me say one thing, water. That's a modern resource that the Chinese really, initially it was timber in eastern Tibet. And there was terrible deforestation in that part of Tibet throughout the 80s and most of the 90s. The Chinese have now prohibited that kind of clear-cutting of forests. But it goes on, it continues to some extent. Water is probably the most precious resource, but they have very large deposits of copper and many other, what's that thing that you need for making batteries?
Yes, hold on.
It's very resource rich.
I want to also give you a rather chilling answer. Tibet, as Mary Beth pointed out, is the Tibetan Plateau, aside from the highest plateau in the world, is a size larger than Western Europe. And because of where it is, for China, it's strategically critical. The reason why 25% of China's nuclear arsenal is stationed on the Tibetan Plateau. Why? Because China's main rival is India. In all the many jobs I've had in my lifetime, I happen to work with Strategic Air Command. It's called separation time. The flight time of an ICBM to India to take out India is cut by several minutes by being stationed on the Tibetan Plateau. It poses a direct dagger at the threat that's being watched. We have one here, and then we'll go right back over. We'll get to you, I promise. It's coming.
Hi, I'm Ben Butler. Actually, I lived in Dharamsala for 2.5 years in the early 70s. And we all know that the Dalai Lama is getting older. So when he passes, it will be a reincarnation process to find a new Dalai Lama. And I've heard it said that he has made mention that he will not be reborn in Tibet, that he will be born outside of Tibet because the Chinese would adopt the Dalai Lama. So at one point I was wondering if there could be two Dalai Lamas once this present Dalai Lama passes away. There might be a Chinese Dalai Lama, then there'll be a Dalai Lama born in India, in Germany, in the United States. Plus, if he's found as a child, he won't be an authority until he's 18 years old. So really what you might have is an 18-year gap without a Dalai Lama full grown. So there's going to be a power vacuum. So is the government in exile going to take over this power vacuum? Who is actually going to be the leaders of Tibet once this present Dalai Lama passes away?
That's a really good question, and part of it I cannot at all. First of all, I'm Catholic, so I can't really talk to you about the Dharma things, because His Holiness once said, and he may have said that to other people as well in this room, people who know His Holiness. I was at a New York Times editorial board meeting with His Holiness, and they were saying, oh, you must just be so pleased that the West is all into Tibetan Buddhism, and Richard Gere and all these people are out there, talking about Tibetan Buddhism and so on. And His Holiness kind of chuckled as he goes. And then he said, yes, it's good to have many friends. He often says, when I came out of Tibet, I had no friends. So it's good to have many friends. But he said, it's important. And then he looked right at me. I don't know why. It was like doing a survey of the room. And he looked at me and he said, it's important to practice your own faith well. So when anybody asks me a question about the Dharma, I can't talk to you about reincarnation politics or reincarnation. I can talk a little bit maybe about reincarnation politics because I have a little more confidence in that Holiness is 73. He's in great health. I was just with him up until Saturday. He was in Washington for a week. So, you know, as a friend of the Dalai Lama, I hate that people always talk about him dying. Because, you know, so far so good. There is this religious element, absolutely. As I said in my talk, His Holiness is the reincarnation of the protector deity of Tibet. This is what that's been here. And therefore, as long as there is a need for him to serve in that capacity, he will be reincarnated. It's true. We spoke very briefly about the Panchen Lama. I have a picture of him somewhere. You know, this is a very interesting story about this young Panchen Lama. It was a reincarnation. The Panchen Lama is this little boy's predecessor. Stayed in Tibet when the Dalai Lama left. They were contemporaries, same age, the previous Panchen Lama. And that Panchen Lama stayed in Tibet. He tried very hard to work with the communist government. In fact, he succeeded in doing that for a long time. They sent him on a fact-finding mission in the Tibetan areas. He came back and he said, very unequivocally, I'm sorry, but your policies were fair. What's happening in Tibet is a kind of a genocide. The Chinese put him in jail, and he stayed in jail for, do you remember how many years Panchen Lama was in jail? 12 years in jail. He came out, he was rehabilitated. He had dinner with the current president, Hu Jintao, who was then not the current president, and he died after 2 years, actually. Very interesting. The Chinese did its best to believe he was poisoned as well. But that Panchen Lama, this little boy is the reincarnation of that Panchen Lama. And when his predecessor died, Dalai Lama knew this was an important historic and religious figure, and he worked very hard with the Chinese government secretively because of the sensitivity to try to cooperate so that he could recognize the Panchen Lama inside Tibet, which ultimately he did, and the Chinese picked up this little boy. This is the only picture we have of him, 6 years old, and he's been disappeared. He's now 20.
He's 21.
Years old,
If he's alive.
if he's alive. They then named their own Panchen Lama, a little boy named Gyaltsen Norbu, who they have groomed all this time to take on the responsibilities. It was the Chinese Communist Party, not any religion, the Chinese Communist Party that identified Gyaltsen Norbu. In fact, at his enthronement ceremony, you have all these Chinese guys in those big square dark glasses and dark suits and shiny black hair conferring all these honors. You don't need to be insulting. But it's just in that context, it looks ridiculous on their alternative. So yes, it is going to be a politically interesting thing, but I don't think we're going to have to deal with it as well. And how it's resolved is a matter of that very esoteric Tibetan Buddhist reincarnation process. Which you have to ask that question of a Lama, not me.
I also want to stress there is a line of control. It wouldn't necessarily go to the Tibetan government in exile for administration. I would also say that, as Holiness has said, he may be the last Dalai Lama. He may stop in Tibet. But the Panchen Lama chooses the one who will recognize who the new Dalai Lama is, which is, the Chinese did this for Gyaltsen Norbu. They named him clearing religious freedom by choosing him as the Panchen Lama. However, until a new Dalai Lama is found, I had an audience in 2008 with a Karmapa Lama, who also stayed in China when he was 14. He was held in relative exile in India until he was 21. He's an incredibly articulate young man. And he would essentially be a spiritual leader until they find him. So there is someone present. He's quite young. Not as young as His Holiness was, that's for sure. But there is this
Yeah, the Dalai Lama has done his best to institute a democratic government in exile community in Tibet. And he has conferred many of his responsibilities, his temporal responsibilities, to the Tibetan government in exile. We have a prime minister who's elected. They have a parliament that's elected. So there are people there who will have this, and this is not something that they're not going to think about until this holiness passes away. They have already. This is very much a people's mind. We'll see.
You've been very patient. The microphone's coming through, I swear.
I just want to know, as ordinary citizens, as students here at Salve, what can we do to contribute? What can we do to help?
That's a great question. And I always tell everybody the same thing. Be in touch with your congressional representative. I mean, we are so lucky as Tibet advocates to have a Congress that understands this issue, that's well informed and that is willing to act. But members of Congress have a primary responsibility to represent the interests of their people, not to represent the special interests of people like me. So what I would do, I don't know who your congressman is.
It's John Hall.
John Hall. So I would, be in touch with Congressman Hall, so you attended a Tibet lecture, and you know the Dalai Lama was in Washington last week. You hope that he will do everything that he can to help the Dalai Lama. There is the President Obama is going to China in mid-November for the first U.S.-China summit of this president's term presidency. It's going to be a big deal for China, huge deal. And it's a big deal for President Obama. So there's an opportunity here for Congress to exert pressure on the president and say, when you meet with President Hu, speak to him about Tibet.
Because of interest, though, I don't know if it's necessarily, I don't know if they feel that would be enough because of U.S., the situation with China owning most of our debt and with their situation and their rising power. It's not necessarily at the forefront of the U.S. interest to, discuss Tibet and to push the subject. So is there anything further beyond just speaking to our representatives?
Yes, but let me just go back to that a minute. I think that we take the wrong position when we cower at China and we say, oh my God, they owe all our debt, we can't do anything. We still have a bigger economy than China. Lots of people own our debt. Japan owns almost over as much debt as China does, and we're not all going crazy about, Japan. What we need to do is exert the kind of influence on China that's transformative and brings them into the League of Nations, to use an old term, in a responsible way so that when we think of China as being powerful, we're not afraid of what that means for us. And I think this is the posture that this administration is trying to do. The Obama administration is what they call strategic reassurance to China, which is we want to work with you. We want to work with you in ways that we can address global problems and so on. But I don't think we should say the president won't raise Tibet because China owns our debt, or any of or that China has a huge army, or whatever. I think Senator McCain actually spoke at an event that the Dalai Lama was at last week in Washington, and he said, to paraphrase, he said, he's standing next to the Dalai Lama. He said, the United States came together not because of under a particular sovereign, not around a particular territory. We came together around a set of principles and beliefs. And this is what makes the United States, this is what gives us our character. So President Obama has to press these issues. He has to talk about freedom and liberty. He has to talk about rule of law. This is part of the American credo. And if he abandons that because China holds our debt, then he's not doing a good job as the American president. So, and I think Obama understands that, but it's good that he's reminded Therefore, write your congressman and ask your congressman to sign the president. Are there other things that you can do? Yes, there's, I'm sure if you go onto the internet or if you send me an email message, there are lots of people who are working hard inside Tibet on small development projects to try to keep Tibetans in the saddle as long as we possibly can and to resist the pressures of Chinese migration. It's tough work and it's under very politically difficult circumstances, but there are ways that you can do that. There's ways that you can support the Tibetan diaspora in exile, the Tibetan refugee communities. Tibetans still walk out of Tibet across the Himalayas on foot in cheap little Chinese-made sneakers with windbreakers or sweatshirts on, no Vortex or any of that fancy stuff, arriving in desperate situations. Parents bring their children out to leave them to have an education in a Tibetan school and be near home as the Dalai Lama. And the community in exile is full of people who need your help.
And from a personal issue, a lot of parents send their children out to Tibet never to see them again because it gives them a chance for their culture and their language to survive. They go into Dharamsala and other places. My daughter's favorite little orphan, Lobsang, a little fat one, he was found in a dumpster in Lhasa when he was a day and a half old. People in private kept him for a year and a half and then smuggled him across the border so he got a chance to live. And I'm curious about the passion in your question. Are you a member of STAND here on campus?
No, I'm not. I'm a student. I'm majoring in international politics, and I'm incredibly passionate about Tibet. It's always been studying this.
Well, I really appreciate it because there's a number of STAND students here tonight who are supporting this. You know about STAND, the Student Action Now for Darfur, and this is a slow genocide. So,
You know, another thing you can do as a student is to work in solidarity with your Amnesty chapter here and your other human rights organizations here. And, you know, because the more that you raise your profile and the more you amplify your voice, write a letter to Hillary Clinton. Tell her how you feel. Say you're my role model in studying international relations. I want to be you when I grow up. And as you, I would pay more attention to Tibet. You know, people respond to those kinds of letters, they really do.
And I'm going to say that that was such a passionate question, I think we ought to end on that one. I thank you for it. You were incredibly patient. And Mary Beth,